The barn had been there for as long as anyone in the county could remember. It stood at the edge of a gently sloping field, its weathered oak boards glowing a soft golden brown in the late afternoon sun. It was no ordinary outbuilding. It was a century-old legacy, built by the protagonist's grandfather when he was just a young man starting his family and his farm. Every beam had been cut and placed by hand. The wooden pegs holding the frame together had been carved on site. The roof had been replaced twice over the decades, but the structure itself remained as solid as the day it was finished. Inside, the air carried the rich scent of old wood mixed with faint traces of hay and machine oil. Tools hung in neat rows along the walls, hammers, wrenches, and saws that had been passed down from one generation to the next. Antique trunks sat tucked in the corners, each holding its own set of family stories. Worn quilts stitched by the protagonist's grandmother, ledgers filled with neat handwriting from a time when farming was done without modern machines, and the old silver pocket watch that had never left the grandfather's vest until the day he passed. When the protagonist inherited the property, they knew the barn was more than just a building. It was a living memory of family resilience, a reminder of hard work and pride. The first time they unlocked its heavy wooden door after moving in, they felt a quiet wave of comfort, like stepping into a place that would always keep them grounded. The barn didn't just hold objects, it held the spirit of those who had built and cared for it. The land was peaceful, bordered on one side by a row of maple trees and on the other by a winding gravel lane. The house sat a short walk from the barn, close enough to watch the sunlight slide across the old roof every morning. It was the perfect place to start fresh. But what the protagonist hadn't expected was the thin, invisible line running along the far side of the property, an invisible boundary that placed their new home inside the jurisdiction of the local homeowners association. At first, the association seemed harmless. The welcome letter in the mailbox was polite, outlining a list of community rules. It mentioned lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and even the correct style of mailbox. The protagonist skimmed through it, shrugging off most of the guidelines. The barn wasn't mentioned anywhere, and since it sat on the back portion of the land, they didn't expect it to be an issue. The first week passed without incident. The protagonist met a few neighbors, pleasant enough people who waved from their driveways or stopped for brief conversations about the weather. A few mentioned the barn in passing, usually with a tone of curiosity rather than criticism. It was, after all, a rare sight among the uniform houses in the neighborhood. It wasn't until the second week that the protagonist noticed the repeated appearances of Karen, the association's president. She was easy to recognize, always dressed in crisp clothing, clipboard in hand, and walking with a purposeful stride. She passed by the barn several times, each time slowing just enough to glance at it. Once, she paused for nearly a full minute, her eyes scanning the door, the windows, and the small loft above. The protagonist waved from the porch, but her smile seemed more calculated than friendly. Still, there was no reason to think much of it. Perhaps she admired the craftsmanship, perhaps she simply liked old buildings, but something about the way she lingered, the way her eyes followed the lines of the barn's structure as if memorizing them, left a small knot of unease in the protagonist's mind. By the end of the week, that unease grew stronger. The protagonist found themselves locking the barn door more often, double-checking it at night, and glancing out the window whenever footsteps crunched on the gravel. The barn was a treasure, and while most people would see it as a charming piece of history, there was a feeling, faint but persistent, that someone might see it as something else entirely. And in the quiet stillness of the property, with the barn standing strong against the passing years, that feeling was about to prove true. The morning began quietly, with sunlight filtering through the kitchen window and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. The protagonist was seated at the table, sorting through the small stack of mail that had arrived the evening before. Most of it was routine, utility bills, a catalog from the local hardware store, and a flyer for a farmer's market. But at the bottom of the stack sat an envelope printed with the Homeowners Association's logo in neat blue lettering. They opened it without much thought, expecting a seasonal newsletter or another welcome message. Instead, the tone was sharply different. The letter stated that the barn was classified as an unsightly structure and that its aged appearance and non-conforming style lowered the overall value of the neighborhood. The association was requesting that it be evaluated for removal or significant modification to meet community standards. For a moment, the protagonist simply stared at the page, the words not quite registering. The barn had stood for 100 years, weathered storms, and remained in remarkable condition. It wasn't rotting, leaning, or unsafe. It was history, a living piece of craftsmanship. Yet here it was, reduced to a non-conforming structure in the neat lines of an official notice. Setting the letter aside, the protagonist decided to address the matter directly. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening in the small community hall near the entrance to the neighborhood. When the night arrived, the protagonist walked into the room carrying a small folder containing photographs of the barn, close-ups of the woodwork, the neatly organized interior, and the strong beams that had held for generations. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows with a long table at the front where the board sat. Karen occupied the center seat, her posture perfectly straight, a clipboard resting in front of her. After a few routine topics, the chairperson invited residents to speak. The protagonist stepped forward and presented the photos, explaining the barn's history and its careful upkeep. The story of the grandfather's work drew a few murmurs of interest from the neighbors present, but before they could continue, Karen interjected. Her voice was calm but firm, stating that the barn did not align with the visual harmony of the community and might discourage potential home buyers. She referred to it as abandoned storage and implied that it fell under the association's oversight because it was a detached outbuilding within the community boundary. The protagonist corrected her, stating clearly that the barn was private property, maintained in excellent condition, and had never been abandoned. A few neighbors exchanged uncertain looks, clearly uncomfortable with the tense exchange. Karen didn't back down. Instead, she proposed that the board conduct an in-person inspection to determine whether the barn complied with the association's rules. The vote was quick. Most members nodded without asking questions, and the inspection was scheduled for 2 weeks later. As the meeting wrapped up, Karen caught the protagonist's eye and gave a small, almost polite smile. But something about the look felt off. Not the smile of someone concerned about rules, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed they had already won. The protagonist left the meeting with the letter still folded in their pocket and a faint, uneasy pressure in their chest. The barn had survived a century without trouble, but now it seemed it was under a kind of scrutiny it had never faced before. Back home, they walked to the barn in the cool evening air, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The golden light from a single bulb spilled over the wooden floor and rows of neatly arranged tools. It looked just as it always had, strong, clean, and full of memories. Yet now, every creak of the old boards and every shadow in the loft seemed to carry the weight of someone else's judgment. The 2-week countdown to the inspection had begun, but the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the barn wasn't the only thing being evaluated. The first week after the board meeting passed, with no further contact from the association, the protagonist tried to focus on daily tasks, mowing the grass, tending the small vegetable garden, and continuing minor repairs on the barn's loft, windows. Still, the scheduled inspection loomed in the back of their mind. It was late on a Thursday night when the first strange noise came. The air outside was still, with only the faint hum of crickets breaking the quiet. Inside, the protagonist was in the living room, halfway through a book, when they heard it. A faint metallic rattle, sharp and deliberate, coming from the direction of the barn. At first they froze, unsure if it was just the wind shaking the latch. But the night was calm and the sound came again, this time followed by a dull scrape. Setting the book aside, they reached for the flashlight that sat by the front door and stepped outside. The yard was dimly lit by the moon, casting pale silver light across the grass. As they moved toward the barn, the rattling stopped abruptly. They paused near the door, shining the flashlight over the lock. It appeared intact, though the hasp seemed slightly bent, as if it had been forced. The old oak door was solid, but the marks near the latch were fresh. They turned the beam upward, scanning the loft windows. No movement. After a long moment of silence, they decided it was probably just a loose hinge catching in the night air. Still, they didn't take chances. The next morning, they replaced the lock with a heavy-duty padlock and reinforced the latch with a new bracket from the hardware store. That afternoon, while working near the front porch, the protagonist's neighbor, a friendly older man named Bill, stopped by. He mentioned he'd been out for a walk around 10 the night before and thought he'd seen someone walking near the barn. "Might have been nothing," Bill said, "but I could swear it was Karen. She had a big tote bag with her." The protagonist's grip on the wrench tightened slightly. The timing matched the noises they'd heard. They thanked Bill for mentioning it, but kept their tone neutral. There was no point in making accusations without proof. Still, the knot of unease in their stomach tightened. That night, they made a point of checking the barn before bed, making sure the new lock was secure. The building stood silent in the darkness, its tall shape outlined against the starlit sky. Inside, everything was untouched. Tools in place, trunks closed, shelves lined neatly with jars and boxes. But as they stood there in the quiet, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside recently, walking among the shadows. The following days passed quietly, though the protagonist noticed Karen's presence more often. She would walk along the edge of the property in the late afternoon, clipboard in hand, glancing toward the barn. Sometimes she paused as if making notes. Other times she simply stared for a moment before moving on. By the time the second week began, the protagonist had taken extra precautions. A small motion sensor light now hung over the barn door, and a set of wireless cameras had been discreetly placed under the eaves. They weren't taking any chances, not with the inspection date drawing closer and the strange behavior continuing. On the night before the scheduled inspection, the weather turned windy. Leaves swirled in the yard, and branches tapped against the roof. Just after midnight, the motion light outside the barn flicked on. The protagonist, who had been unable to sleep, was already by the window. They saw nothing but the empty yard. Still, they kept watching, heart beating faster, wondering if they had just missed someone slipping into the shadows. The barn stood silently, as it always had, but the air carried a different feeling now, like the calm before a storm. Whatever was coming with the inspection, it wasn't going to be a simple walkthrough. The morning of the inspection arrived with a sky washed pale by thin clouds. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that hinted at early autumn. The protagonist had been up since sunrise, drinking coffee at the kitchen table and watching the gravel lane through the front window. The barn stood silent in the distance, its tall roofline cutting across the horizon. Inside, everything had been carefully arranged the night before. Tools neatly hung, floors swept, trunks closed. It wasn't about impressing the homeowners association, it was about protecting the barn's dignity. This was family history, not just a building to be judged against a checklist. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the quiet. A silver sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a compact SUV. Karen stepped out of the first vehicle, wearing a tailored jacket and carrying her familiar clipboard. Two board members emerged from the SUV, both wearing polite but guarded expressions. "Good morning," Karen called out, her voice warm on the surface but clipped beneath. "We're here for the scheduled inspection." The protagonist stepped onto the porch and greeted them with calm courtesy. "Good morning," As I mentioned before, the barn is not subject to association inspection. It's private property, predating the HOA, and outside your jurisdiction. Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. We'll just have a quick look. Our guidelines require that we ensure all structures are safe and in harmony with the neighborhood's appearance. I appreciate your concern, the protagonist replied evenly. But again, you don't have legal authority here. Without a warrant or formal legal request, I can't allow entry. There was a pause. The two board members exchanged glances, as if unsure whether to push further. Karen broke the silence by stepping forward, her tone suddenly firmer. We can't sign off on this property without seeing the inside. If you're confident everything is in order, there shouldn't be a problem. The protagonist stood there, ground, saying nothing. Then, without warning, one of the board members reached for the barn's latch. The protagonist moved quickly, but the man had already swung the door open. Karen brushed past them with surprising speed, her shoes tapping against the wooden floor as she disappeared inside. The protagonist followed, their voice calm but sharp. You need to leave immediately. But Karen was already in the far corner, kneeling beside an antique trunk. Her hands moved quickly, flipping open the lid as if searching for something. The air inside the barn felt heavier, the musty scent of old wood mingling with a tension that made every sound echo louder. When she turned, the protagonist's eyes locked on what she was holding. A silver pocket watch, its chain draped over. Her fingers. The watch's polished surface caught the light, the same one that had hung from the grandfather's vest pocket for decades. What are you doing with that? The protagonist asked, their voice still steady but colder now. Karen straightened, the watch still in her hand. Cataloging items, she said quickly. Any abandoned or unclaimed property within our boundaries must be recorded for community inventory. It's not abandoned, the protagonist replied. It's a family heirloom. The other board members stood frozen near the door, clearly unsure of what to say. Karen's expression shifted, still polite, but with a flicker of something harder beneath. She slipped the watch back into the trunk and closed it, as though the moment could be erased. The protagonist stepped forward, pulling their phone from their pocket and quietly taking photos. The lock on the barn, the open trunk, the watch in. Karen's hand. It was all recorded in seconds. Karen seemed to notice but said nothing, only smoothing her jacket and glancing toward the door. We'll make our report, she said, her tone back to a businesslike calm. Thank you for your time. She walked out without another word, the two board members following behind in uneasy silence. The vehicles rolled back down the driveway, leaving the gravel dust hanging briefly in the air. The barn was quiet again, but the stillness felt different this time. Not peaceful, but charged with the certainty that this was no longer about rules or appearances. Something deeper was at play, and the protagonist knew the real confrontation had only just begun. The barn door clicked shut with a weight that seemed heavier than its actual wood and iron. The protagonist stood in the quiet for a long moment after the vehicles left, listening to the distant hum of the highway far beyond the property. Sunlight streamed through the loft window, catching the faint shimmer of dust in the air, but the warmth of the scene didn't match the cold knot tightening in their chest. They walked to the trunk where Karen had been crouched just minutes earlier. The silver pocket watch was back inside, resting atop a folded wool blanket. It was harmless in appearance, but the image of it dangling from Karen's fingers felt anything but harmless. That watch had passed from the grandfather's vest pocket to the father's bedside drawer and finally into this trunk, not once leaving the family's care. The protagonist reached for their phone and scrolled through the pictures they had just taken. There it was. Karen's hand holding the watch, her fingers curled loosely around the chain. In the background, the open trunk and the weathered barn walls provided context. A few more shots captured the lock on the door and the bent hasp from the night they had heard the rattling. It was evidence, enough to show she had been inside, touching property she had no right to handle. but the protagonist wasn't ready to confront her outright. Acting too quickly might allow her to twist the story, claim it was a misunderstanding, or worse, turn the attention back on them. No, this required patience and a plan. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, sketching out the next steps. The first was to protect the barn even more securely. The motion sensor light was fine, but now they installed a wireless security camera inside the barn itself, hidden high in the rafters where it had a full view of the floor and trunks. Another camera was placed outside, angled toward the door. The second step was to gather background. They began quietly talking to a few neighbors, without accusing anyone, just asking if anyone had ever had unusual visits from board members or experienced property concerns. To their surprise, two neighbors shared small but telling stories. A missing garden decoration, a set of old tools gone from a shed, both occurring after a routine inspection. No one had proof, but the pattern was unsettling. Over the next few days, Karen made no direct contact, but her presence was still felt. She passed the property slowly on her walks, sometimes stopping just long enough to write something on her clipboard. The protagonist didn't wave, and she didn't either. It was a silent acknowledgement that each knew the other was paying attention. The protagonist also visited the county records office. There, in a quiet room with rows of file cabinets and a faint smell of paper and ink, they found exactly what they needed: a map showing the barn's construction date and land boundaries. It was dated nearly 80 years before the homeowners' association even existed. That alone proved the barn was outside their control. Returning home with copies of the documents, the protagonist stored them in a folder with the photographs and neighbor statements. The file was growing thicker, solid enough to present to the board and perhaps even to the authorities if it came to that. That night, as they locked the barn door, the moonlight spilled across the gravel path. Inside, the watch rested in its place. The tools hung in their rows, and the air smelled of dry wood and oil. Everything was where it should be for now, but the protagonist knew Karen wouldn't simply let the matter go. She had stepped into the barn without permission, touched a piece of family history, and walked away as though it were routine. Whatever her reasons, they were strong enough that she was willing to risk being caught, and that meant she would almost certainly be back. The protagonist closed the barn door, the new lock clicking into place, and stepped away with the quiet certainty that the next time Karen crossed that threshold, it wouldn't just be her word against theirs. It would be proof, undeniable, visible, and impossible to explain away. The days after the inspection had an uneasy calm, the kind that made the protagonist feel like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The barn stood in the field, as it always had, but now it felt like the center of a quiet storm. Every creak of the boards, every rustle of the grass outside seemed sharper, more significant. The protagonist spent the weekend fine-tuning their plan. The security cameras installed. Earlier were checked twice. Batteries replaced, and memory cards cleared to ensure there was plenty of space for new footage. The hidden camera in the rafters had the best angle. It could see the door, the trunks, and most of the interior. Another camera on the exterior covered the entire approach from the lane. On Monday, the protagonist made a quiet trip into town. They visited the small law office where they'd met with a friendly attorney once before during the property transfer. Sitting across the polished desk, they laid out the photographs, the county records proving the barn's independence from the homeowners association and the neighbor statements. The attorney listened carefully, his brow tightening when he saw the picture of Karen holding the pocket watch. "This is trespassing," he said plainly. "And if she removed anything, that's theft. You're within your rights to involve law enforcement." The protagonist agreed, but asked whether it was better to wait until they had a complete picture, footage that showed the entry, the handling of items, and the absence of permission. The attorney leaned back in his chair, considering. "If you can catch her in the act on camera, there's no room for dispute. That would close the matter completely." Leaving the office with a quiet determination, the protagonist stopped at the hardware store and picked up an additional motion light for the barn's back corner, where the shadows tended to hide anyone approaching from the rear. They also purchased a discreet audio recorder, something to capture conversations if the need arose. By midweek, Karen's behavior began to shift. She was seen less often on her usual walks, but when she did appear, she seemed to glance around, more than before, as if checking to see who might be watching her. One afternoon, the protagonist saw her talking with another board member in low tones at the far end of the lane. Both looked toward the barn twice before parting ways. The protagonist didn't confront her. Instead, they went about their normal routine, gardening, repairing the porch railing, even inviting a couple of neighbors over for coffee. On the surface, life appeared calm. Beneath that calm, every detail was being recorded and stored. Night before the next board meeting, the protagonist reviewed the security footage so far. Most of it was uneventful, squirrels darting across the field, the occasional delivery truck passing on the lane, but once or twice the cameras caught movement in the distance that looked very much like a person walking the property line after dark. That evening, a low wind moved through the trees, making the motion light flicker once before going still again. The barn was locked, the cameras were ready, and the plan was simple. If Karen returned, the footage would tell the entire story. The protagonist lay awake longer than usual, listening to the faint sounds outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The house itself felt watchful, like every board and window was leaning toward the field. They knew that once the truth was captured, everything would change. The next meeting wouldn't be about vague, unsightly structures or imagined violations. It would be about evidence, law, and the simple fact that some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. And when that moment came, Karen wouldn't be able to step back behind polite words or clipped smiles. She would be standing in the light, with nowhere else to go. The day of the Homeowners Association meeting arrived with a sense of finality. The protagonist had everything prepared: footage from the barn's security cameras, still photographs, printed maps of the property lines, and the county's records, showing the barn's long-standing independence from association oversight. Everything was neatly organized in a folder, ready to be laid out in order. The community hall was already half full when the protagonist arrived. Rows of metal folding chairs faced the long table where the board members sat. Karen was in the center, her posture as straight as always, a small stack of papers in front of her. She glanced up briefly when the protagonist walked in, offering the faintest nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement that suggested she didn't expect anything unusual to happen tonight. The meeting began with routine business, budget reports, lawn maintenance reminders, and updates on neighborhood events. The tone was formal, even dull, but the protagonist's focus didn't waver. When the chairperson reached the open floor portion of the agenda, the protagonist stood and stepped forward. "I have something to present," they said calmly, placing the folder on the table at the front of the room. Karen's eyes flicked to the folder, but her expression didn't change. "Proceed," she said, her tone light but controlled. The protagonist began by holding up a large printed map, pointing to the section where the barn sat. "This is the official property map from the county records office," they explained. The barn was built over a century ago, long before this association was formed. It is not, and has never been, subject to the HOA's jurisdiction. A few murmurs rippled through the room. The protagonist set the map aside and pulled out the photographs. On inspection day, without my permission, members of this board entered my barn. These photos show what happened inside. They held up the first image. Karen, crouched beside the antique trunk, holding the silver pocket watch in her hand. The second photo showed the bent latch on the door. Several neighbors leaned forward to get a better look. Karen's voice broke the quiet. "That's not the full story. I was simply examining..." The protagonist raised a hand slightly. There's more. From a small case, they took out a laptop connected to a portable projector. The screen lit up against the white wall at the back of the hall. The room fell silent as the video began. The footage showed Karen entering the barn, looking around quickly, then walking straight to the trunk in the corner. She opened it, lifted the watch, and turned it in her hands. The video had no sound, but the image was clear. She closed the trunk, looked toward the door, and left without speaking to anyone. Gasps rose from the audience. One board member turned in their chair to look at Karen, his expression tight. The protagonist let the footage run to its end before pausing it on the frame where the watch gleamed in Karen's hand. "This is not a matter of community rules or property appearance," they said. "This is a matter of trespassing and handling personal property without consent, and I have more than one neighbor who has had similar experiences after inspections." A wave of conversation broke out among the residents. Some whispered to each other. Others spoke openly, questioning how often this might have happened. The chairperson, looking uncomfortable, turned to Karen. "Do you have a response?" Karen's voice was steady but quieter now. "I was performing my duties as president. I believed—" The chairperson cut her off. "That is not within the scope of our responsibilities." One of the other board members cleared his throat. "Given the evidence, I move that we call for an immediate vote on removing Karen from her position as president." Hands went up quickly, more than enough to carry the motion. The decision was made in under a minute. Karen sat back in her chair, her clipboard untouched, her gaze fixed on the table. The protagonist closed the laptop and gathered the folder. The meeting moved on to other business, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The board had been shaken, the neighbors were alert, and the barn story was now known to everyone present. The next step, the protagonist knew, would take place far beyond the walls of this hall. The meeting had ended, but the ripples from that night spread quickly through the neighborhood. By morning, word had traveled far beyond those who had been in the room. Neighbors who had never shown much interest in the barn now stopped by during walks, offering quiet nods of support or brief comments about how they had always wondered about those inspections. The protagonist didn't seek the spotlight, but the attention made one thing clear. People were watching the homeowners association much more closely now. The board, shaken by the vote, moved to fill the vacant president's seat with someone less confrontational, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Delaney. She was polite, organized, and, most importantly, had no interest in expanding the HOA's reach beyond what the bylaws allowed. Karen, however, didn't disappear quietly. For a week after the meeting, she was seen walking the neighborhood with her phone in hand, speaking in clipped tones. Rumors swirled that she was consulting with an attorney, but nothing concrete came of it. Then, without warning, her house went up for sale. By the end of the month, she was gone. The protagonist focused on restoring the barn's sense of peace. They repaired the bent latch on the main door and added a stronger lock. The antique trunk was returned to its usual place, its contents untouched since that day. One sunny afternoon, they spent hours polishing the silver pocket watch, its surface gleaming once more. It now rested in a glass case on a shelf in the farmhouse, safe from curious hands. It wasn't just the locks that had changed. The barn now had a presence. It was a piece of living history that the neighbors respected more openly. Some even asked if they could tour it, to see the beams hand-hewn by the protagonist's grandfather, the old farm tools still hanging neatly on the walls, and the wide loft that had once stored hay. The protagonist agreed to small visits, always supervised, and used those moments to share the barn's history and its place in the land's story. The Homeowners Association, under new leadership, began revising its inspection policies. No member was allowed to enter private structures without written consent, and inspections had to be scheduled and documented. The changes were adopted unanimously, a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened should never happen again. Months passed, and the barn settled back into its rhythm, the steady hum of summer insects, the creak of wood in the wind, and the occasional soft thud of an apple falling from the tree out front. But now, when the protagonist looked toward it from the farmhouse porch, there was no trace of the unease that had once shadowed it. One autumn evening, the protagonist stood by the barn door, looking out across the field. The sun was low, turning, the grass gold and the sky a deep amber. A couple walking their dog waved from the lane, and the protagonist waved back. It struck them then that this wasn't just about winning a dispute. It was about protecting something worth keeping. The barn had stood for 100 years, weathering storms and seasons, and now it had weathered one more kind of challenge. The protagonist's grandfather had built it for storing tools, hay, and harvests, but it had become something else entirely, a reminder that some places hold more than possessions. They hold trust. That trust had been tested, but it had also been restored. And in the quiet of the evening, with the barn's shadow stretching long across the field, the protagonist felt certain that it would remain intact for the next 100 years as well. The homeowners association might still hold meetings, discuss rules, and debate landscaping guidelines, but the line had been drawn clearly now. The barn was not just a building, it was a legacy. And legacies, once defended, are not easily taken. With that thought, the protagonist turned, locked the door one last time for the night, and walked back toward the farmhouse. The air was cool, the stars were beginning to show, and the barn stood, quietly behind them, safe, steadfast, and entirely their own.